In tonight's Dorchester segment, we'll hear about designing a park for climate change and controversy on Meeting House Hill about the location of sober houses. To fill us in is the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Of course.
Jennifer, why are sober houses such a big deal in Dorchester right now?
I think the easy answer is because there are a lot of them. Sober houses, again, are a kind of generally not state-regulated type of property to begin with. So there is a voluntary certification system you can go through to make sure that you're getting referrals from people, for instance, leaving state resources or leaving detox centers. But sober houses are basically just places where people agree to be sober together. If they have state certification, it means that there are drug tests involved to make sure that they remain sober while they're in these houses. But unless they're certified, there's not even a really basic way to keep track of where all of these things are. Now, the reason that people kind of can be a little bit sensitive about them, and the reason that it's come up in the news this week, is because there are some areas that are really dealing with a lot of density of sober houses. The vast majority of the city's sober houses are, for instance, in Dorchester and Roxbury. So you've got areas that are already kind of historically disenfranchised and dealing with this burden that, as State Rep Liz Miranda put it at a meeting the other night, nobody else has to deal with at quite this scale. She said basically that she would bet her salary that no other state rep in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts would fight her for the dubious honor of claiming that they had the most density of this kind of housing. And it's a tricky topic right now because obviously we have an opioid crisis, and everyone agrees that those who are struggling with addiction do need a place to go that's longer than, say, a 7-day detox center or even a 30-day detox center. But the question is, why are the regulations so loose on how they can be located?
Well, these places are badly needed. Sometimes they're not well run, but what kind of problems do neighbors think they would have from a sober house?
It's not necessarily an issue of problems, which is what makes the conversation a little bit complicated. It's more of a question, for instance, the thing that's bubbled up recently is on this intersection of Potosi and Percival Streets in Meeting House Hill, where there's only 11 houses on that entire block, and most of them are single-family homes. And one of these houses, 16 Potosi Street, is already a sober house that has about 19 women living in it. And it just kind of popped up one day. And then what they realized recently was there was a flip of a house just 2 homes away from that was proposed as a sober home for 15 more women. And neighbors didn't know about this until mattresses suddenly started going into this large Victorian. So it's more of a question of suddenly and abruptly changing the density of the street in a way that neighbors aren't aware of. Nobody's objecting to the idea of the sober housing, just more, why is there so much of it being proposed for this very small area, and why is no one being told about it?
Now, what I also pick up here, this is a very engaged neighborhood civically. And what's going on is that there's a meeting, city officials say they don't know what the people operating these houses are doing all the time. And then there are people in meetings say, well, maybe people in the city do know some things, but they're not telling the neighborhood. That does not seem very nice.
Yeah, so it is very, very messy. So for instance, the city is kind of limited as far as what it can actually monitor. For instance, ISD Commissioner Buddy Christopher has sort of been involved in this process because, as you can imagine, neighbors seeing 30 mattresses moving into a house freaked out a little bit and called inspectional services in the same way they would if they suspected there was an illegal lodging house situation, which is regulated, of course. And so the city goes in and they make sure that it is actually a group of people that are supposedly living as a family, which is considered a group of people living with a common purpose, in this case, to be sober, which means they're not actually held to the same zoning standards as a normal lodging house of, say, 15 people would be. So if they're within city zoning, the city can't really do anything about it, and so all they can kind of do is encourage the owners of these houses to be good neighbors. But unless someone had called inspectional services, there's no reason they would have known that this house was even there. So there is that kind of communication issue.
Now, there's that one house on Percival Street. It's listed on a statewide directory as being a recovery place for women. What is going to happen with that now?
So with 29 Percival Street, which interesting history to that house was actually the former home of Charlotte Golar Ritchie and Winston Ritchie, so it is a politically connected house to begin with. There's some possible good news as far as the neighbors are concerned, which is after a pretty contentious meeting in which Joe Pizzaveri, who is the owner of the house, said that he was planning on moving forward to making it a sober home, facing a lot of pushback, especially from city officials, including the chief of housing, Sheila Dillon. Then just last night and today confirmed to me that they're putting those plans on hold for now until they can talk with neighbors, talk with city officials, and figure out what he described as a happy middle going forward. So it's still kind of in limbo, but he's not moving forward with the sober house plan at this moment.
This is Vienna News, and we're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, another thing that your paper is covering with some very nice graphics are these plans for Moakley Park, formerly Columbus Park. And I guess they're going to turn it into a waterfront park, which sounds very nice, but there's another factor here, I guess, about climate change.
Yes. So as we've talked about before, and it's a very hot topic in the city of Boston, we know that we're going to be facing some sea level rise. We know that we're going to be facing a higher frequency of storms. And as anyone that's ever driven along Day Boulevard or Morrissey Boulevard knows, at this point, it basically takes one bad storm to shut the whole thing down. And Moakley Park sits just on the other side of Day Boulevard, right next to Carson Beach. So whenever that floods, there's kind of a ripple effect, so to speak, on the park itself, which then kind of serves as a channel into the south end. So if waters ever rise, if you look at the long-term flood maps, the south end would flood because of the route through Moakley Park. So the thing that the city has been doing, and they've rolled out some, as you noted, some really nice renderings of what they want to do with it, which is in part create a new berm that would effectively stop water from coming into the park, and basically have a new sports area. But the thing that's really caused some controversy is this initial rendering, which is very, very preliminary. There's no funding in place or anything for this. There's no timeline. It does actually show a missing chunk of Day Boulevard. So it seems like the proposal right now would actually be to kind of cut off Day Boulevard right next to Carson Beach and sort of reroute drivers. So there would just kind of be a beachy, sandy berm where right now there's actually a major throughway through South Boston.
Yeah, you're eliminating a barrier to the water for people enjoying the park, but on the other hand, the motorists, with so much congestion at Kosciuszko Circle, for example, not too far from there, it looks like it's a dicey thing to plan.
Yeah, that actually is a very good point, which is it's raised, again, this question of how is the city planning for Kosciuszko Circle? How is the state planning for Kosciuszko Circle? Right now, it's very unclear how the state and city even want traffic to flow through this area, where it changes hands basically as you go through, where you've got Day Boulevard and Morrissey Boulevard are both owned by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The state obviously controls Kosciuszko Circle. The nearby JFK UMass stop is controlled by the MBTA. So these are all state-controlled transit centers, but it's very unclear how they're supposed to be interacting. People have been calling for Kosciuszko Circle to be overhauled in some major way for I don't even know how many decades at this point. And one thing that I actually checked in on this week was what the plans are even regarding Morrissey Boulevard. And right now they are on hold. They're still stuck at this 25% design stage while they try and figure out easements and access issues. So that's kind of not going anywhere right now. So there's not even a future meeting planned for it until they figure out easement issues. So for the city to roll out this kind of bold plan regarding one of the major DCR controlled roadways without a clear sense of what we're doing with a pretty horrible rotary and the other nearby state-owned road, it's kind of up in the air.
The city has just come out with another annual report about housing production and affordability. A lot of pats on the back, but they're also saying they need to do better too.
Yes, so that's not really a new pattern. We have been seeing this over time. For context, the inclusionary development policy, which determines how much affordable housing is included in any new project that specifically requires city approval. So, for instance, if you're trying to build a 20-story building on a place that isn't zoned for it, you have to go to the city and say, can I do this? And as a byproduct of needing to do that, the city has set through executive order the standards of everywhere in the city, if they want to include on-site affordable housing as part of this project that they're building, they have to make 13% of their units affordable. And generally speaking, that means they're kind of going up to about $80,000 a year or so, around 70% of what's called the area median income. But then if you look kind of in different zones as well, so you've got sort of the downtown area, you've got more of the western Boston area around like Jamaica Plain, and then you have the area that's like Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. They all have different standards as far as what amount of units should be built that are affordable. So they redid that in 2015, and they're about to take a new look at it all over again to find out, what's the market look like now? It's changed a lot in 3 years. The city is booming, more people are moving in, and there is kind of the question of whether or not the housing that's being produced is actually matching the income levels of the people that are trying to live there. So they're going to be having several meetings over the course of the spring and the summer to basically talk to residents and also developers to find out, can developers give more, whether it's building more units on and off site or paying more into a fund that can be used to build affordable housing elsewhere in the city, or if we're kind of stretched or tapped out right now. One of the big conversations is kind of comparing it to Cambridge, which has already hit a 20% affordable unit requirement. But there's a lot of debate within the city of Boston about whether or not that's actually slowing down Cambridge's potential to build affordable housing because it sets such a high standard for developers to hit. So that is an ongoing conversation, but they hope to actually roll out a new plan for the city standards by the end of this year.
The district attorney, Rachael Rollins, has come up with a sort of a policy memo with its wide-ranging. We've heard about some of this before already, but what's new here, especially about potential conflict with federal authorities?
Yeah, so one of the things that has come up, as you noted, one of the consistent threads has been that the office is planning on rerouting some of its focus from prosecuting nonviolent crimes, or what DA Rollins classifies as crimes of desperation, which is nonviolent drug offenses, breaking and entering for purposes of shelter, that sort of thing, and focusing on assaults and batteries, murder, that kind of thing. But so we knew that already, but that's included in the memo. Same amount of pushback as before on that front. What is new is a specific thing that she's planning on implementing with regard to immigration officials. Now, we all know that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, has been kind of a hot topic with regard to being in courthouses or being in other areas where people might not be with, they might not be there with legitimate or legal immigration status, and basically using the government's inclination to ask anyone who has information about something to come forward, testify, be helpful. And then also, if people commit a crime, authorities need to have the ability to then go forward and prosecute them. But there's a risk on top of that that's additional for more vulnerable immigrants, because if you are brought into a courthouse, for instance, with a minor felony charge, and there are immigration officials there, they might then also try and deport that person or deal with them there. So what Rachael Rollins is proposing is that her DAs, her attorneys, those that she's working with, let her know if there's actually a federal presence in these courthouses or anywhere that they're interacting. And additionally, that there might actually be a reason to charge a less extreme offense to those of that kind of immigration status, so then they wouldn't be put in that situation of facing deportation because they have committed a more serious crime that would automatically trigger that sort of process. That hasn't been received very well by ICE, who say that this is basically flying in the face of their mission, which is to enforce the immigration policies that we have right now, and that there shouldn't be an elected official, especially, a prosecutor, the top prosecutor in the state, that is actively stumping their desire to fill out their mission. So there is a real back and forth there, and it's pretty tense. There's accusations flying both ways.
Well, Jennifer, I know you get some more details in the Reporter about things like the trolley study that's going to be happening.
Lots of transit.
Yes, so if people want to keep up with that, what's the best way?
So the best way is to either pick up a physical paper or go online to .news.com, or you could follow us on Twitter @.news or me @jen.smith.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Of course.
Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Up ahead, summer camp in New Hampshire, thanks to an agency in the South End. But first, this message.